That's a rocket.
Hi, my name's Keith Brooks. I'm a writer, director, actor, nunchuck enthusiast, super cool diabetic, and thank you for clicking on a new series. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most mind-bending series of all time. The partially independent, partially mainstream studio releases of Phantasm. Boy, let's talk about some balls. Wait, no. I didn't mean it like... Phantasm is a horror franchise created by Don Coscarelli that officially contains 5 films, 1 remake, a remake of the remake, 1 novelization, and 1 comic book. And all of it super fucking weird.
Phantasm.
Phantasm was released in 1979, directed by the guy who wrote and directed Beastmaster, and starring Calvin McCullough from Alias. It starts off at Morningside Mortuary, grave, creepy place, and it's a weird sex scene. Look, I've had the sex once at least. The way they're doing it doesn't make sense to me, but maybe I've been doing it wrong. Who knows? There's always room for improvement, I suppose. But you have a guy named Tommy laying on his back, another pair of legs on top of his, parallel to his, but then when we cut to a different angle, the woman's sitting up, but her legs are still flat, so she would have to be contorted in a weird... Whatever. Tommy's getting laid in the graveyard. Good for him, man. So Tommy is having sex with this strange woman that we will soon come to know as the Lady in Lavender. And at the point of finishing up, the Lady in Lavender pulls a knife from somewhere, I don't fucking know, and stabs Tommy. Tommy dies, and as he's dying, Lady in Lavender turns into an old man. Then we slam cut to some other time. It's a funeral. We meet Jody, and we meet Reggie. Jody is basically our lead, the young, attractive male, and Reggie has a much cooler haircut than Jody does. They're talking about their friend Tommy, who has committed suicide. They're understanding what's happened. They are at his funeral. There's some weird stuff going on at the funeral home. Jody starts to look around. He sees that same old man that we saw earlier is the Undertaker at this funeral. Not the Undertaker as in rest in peace. Different type of Undertaker. We also see that Jody's younger brother, Mike, who's 13 years old, is spying on the funeral, but we also establish quickly that Jody and Mike's parents are deceased. Jody goes to visit the father's entombment, encasket. I don't know what the fuck it's called. He's in like a shelf from the South. We throw people in the dirt, drink a beer. Mike, who is spying on the funeral, hangs around once everybody else is gone and sees this older man, referred to as the tall man, come and pick up Tommy's 500-pound casket out of the ground, throw it into the back of a hearse, and drive the fuck off like he was just taking out the garbage. Mike is obviously freaked the fuck out about all of this. He then goes to see a psychic, and they rip off a scene from Dune. The psychic has like a granddaughter who's Mike's age, and the psychic is this old blind lady, and she manifests a box, and she tells Mike to put his hand into the box, and it starts hurting him. Mike's freaked the fuck out, and then the little girl is like, you have to get rid of your fear. Fear is the mind killer. Do you have any spice or some shit like that? And then Mike stops being afraid and the box disappears. Jody, his older brother, Mike's older brother, winds up going on a date with the Lady in Lavender somehow. I don't know. It's sort of confusing. And they wind up going to the cemetery. And they're getting hot and fresh and Spice Channel-ish. You find out that Mike is spying on his older brother, Jody. He doesn't know boundaries. When he gets scared by a Jawa-looking thing, some dwarf-like creature in a brown robe starts freaking him out, so Mike runs. Jody sees Mike running, chases after him, leaving the lady that he was fooling around with. He catches up with his brother, tries to see what's going on. Mike's talking about short people in robes. And Jody's like, fuck this, I'm gonna go back and have sex with the lady who was wearing some purplish color. And he goes back and she's gone, and he's like, fuck, blue balls tonight. But Mike is not convinced, so he goes back to the cemetery and breaks into Morningside. Then, all of a sudden, around the corner, he's being chased by a spherical silver ball of death. And it's flying around every corner, trying to catch up to Mike. Mike runs into a grimacing caretaker. When he runs into the caretaker's holding him with nefarious purposes. When all of a sudden the silver ball comes, Mike gets out of the way just in time for the silver ball to put a spike out and slam into the caretaker's head. A drill then protrudes from the ball and starts drilling out the blood from the caretaker's brain and just squirting it. The caretaker falls down dead. And in a scene that was super controversial at the time, but it's a really great scene, you see the caretaker's feet, Mike's hiding in the background, and you slowly see this puddle of urine empty from the caretaker's body. It's a really fucking intense, brutal thing that happens there, but whatever. The movie keeps going. We further establish who Reggie is. Reggie and Jody are best friends. Reggie's also an ice cream man, for what that's worth. Mike's trying to escape from the mausoleum, and this tall man character is chasing after him. And Mike goes to slam the door, but he slams it on the tall man's fingers, and one of the fingers breaks off. And Mike, who again has some issues, takes the finger with him. He puts it in a box, thinking this is what's going to convince my brother that I'm not crazy. Is a detached human finger. The finger from the tall man did bleed yellow, like this weird, not like pus yellow, but like fucking vibrant early 90s Burger King kids sort of color yellow. Mike shows his older brother Jody this box that has a finger in it, and it's moving, like just so wiggling around. And Jody's response is the best in the world. Like if any movie, he just goes, "Yep, I believe you now." That's it. That's how that convincing happens. Mike is wandering around the town, and he is walking past Reggie's ice cream truck, which is like emitting CO2 and all that stuff and all the cool, cold chill of it. The tall man walks past the ice cream truck and gets some of that chill in his face, and he has this moment of, is it euphoria? Is it fear? It's this strange thing that just makes him pause for a second. There's a jam session earlier with Reggie and Jody where Reggie pulls out a tuning fork or some shit. I don't know, he has a tuning fork. We're going to establish he has a tuning fork because that'll be, I guess, important later. I don't know. But eventually, that same finger turns into like a fly creature of death and attacks Jody and Mike. And they start throwing it into the garbage disposal. And then Reggie walks in and he's like, hey, I sell ice cream and sing music and play guitar. And the fly thing attacks him. And they finally put it back in the garbage disposal. And now everybody's convinced. Scary shit is afoot. All that stuff. Jody and Reggie, I think, leave. Mike stays at home. He figures out a way to break out of his house with like a bullet hammer. Once he breaks out, there's the tall man waiting for him. I think there's another spear. Jody goes to the cemetery to check it out himself. He gets ambushed by all the dwarf creatures, and then all of a sudden his car rolls up. But it's this awesome, badass black Himikuda, but Mike, who's the 13-year-old, is driving it, and he rescues his older brother. And as they're driving away, a hearse starts chasing them. They run the hearse off the road, and they see that it's another one of these dwarf creatures. The impact of the wreck has killed it. They pull its hood back and reveal Tommy, who died at the beginning of the movie's face, is now on a dwarf creature. They now know they have to defeat the tall man. So in order to do that, Jody takes Mike to drop them off with two of his friends who run an antique store. I think their names are like Sally and Sue. But fuck yeah, their names were Sally and Sue. This is some R.L. Stine's Goosebumps writing shit. Mike starts looking around at stuff and he finds a photo. And all of a sudden it goes Pennywise from the TV movie. And the photo looks at him and he realizes it's of the tall man. So Mike's like, I gotta get the fuck out of here. I don't want to be here anymore. Take me home now. So Sally and Sue get Mike in the car. They start driving him home. And as they're driving there, they see Reggie's ice cream truck wrecked. And then all of a sudden dwarves descend on the car. And somehow Mike gets thrown out of the car. And the dwarves take Sally and Sue and their vehicle away to Morningside. At that moment, I think Jody's chilling by a fire. And him and Mike have like this psychic connection weird thing. Mike gets locked in his house again. Jody's going to the mausoleum to kill the tall man. Mike breaks out of his house again, but there's the tall man chasing after him. And like at a certain point, the tall man knocks the fucking front door off the house. It's the best shot in the entire fucking movie. It's pretty fucking epic and terrifying. The tall man kidnaps Mike, throws him in the hearse, starts driving. Mike somehow gets out of the hearse again, but he's outside of the mausoleum, so he goes into the mausoleum to look for Jody. While he's in there, they run into Reggie. Reggie had been kidnapped as well. Reggie says, by the way, he also kidnapped a bunch of girls off screen. I freed them off screen. All of this cool action stuff off screen. So now it's Reggie, Mike, and Jody looking through this mausoleum, and they stumble upon an all-white room that has these like black, you know those like big egg-looking things? It has like a shit ton of those filled with dwarf bodies. And it has these two silver spools sticking out of the floor. They look through the silver spools and you realize it's a portal, and it's a portal to this red world that's really fucking hot, and all these dwarf guys are slaves there. And they realize, oh, that must be what the tall man is doing. He's trying to make slaves out of all these bodies. It's convoluted, but okay, whatever. There's a sudden power outage. And they're all separated after this point. Reggie's left alone in this room, and he thinks about his tuning fork. He decides to activate the portal in some way that creates like a vacuum, so it starts sucking all of the bodies out, and then magically Mike and Jody are outside, and they find each other, and it's super windy, but it doesn't affect the audio quality whatsoever. Reggie finds his way outside, and all of a sudden he runs into this woman in lavender. A lady in lavender, one might say. Reggie turns around, he gets stabbed in the gut, it turns into the tall man. Reggie's dying there, the mausoleum gets sucked into some world, but the tall man's still there. Mike and Jody go back home, and they decide, we still have to kill the tall man. I can't believe Reggie's gone, oh my god. Jody's gonna go look at some abandoned mine to try to trap the tall man in. Mike stays at home, and the tall man comes for Mike again. I think this is the part where he actually blows the door off the hinges. The tall man starts chasing Mike. Mike starts running through the woods. Tall man's chasing after him, and we realize he's leading him straight to the mine. And they drop the tall man in this abandoned mine. And then Mike wakes up, and he's beside a fire, and Reggie's holding him. You find out that Jody, his brother, died in a car crash. And none of this tall man stuff is real. And he's just struggling with the thought that his parents have died recently, and that his brother has died, and he's sort of left alone. And Reggie, the ice cream man who's alive, is like, well, you know what you need? You need a road trip. Why don't you go pack your bags? Let's get the fuck out of here. So he goes to his room to pack his bags, and he closes his closet door, and there's a mirror, and behind him is the tall man, like scrunched up, trying to hide, going, boy! And then that's the end of the movie. The film was independent and self-financed. It wasn't the director's first film. It was actually like his third feature film. Don Coscarelli is the youngest director in all of history to sell a feature film to a major studio. This was not that film. Being self-financed, though, they rented equipment from local rental houses. And they would rent equipment on a Friday so they could use it for the weekend and return it on Monday and still only have to pay one day, which is something independent filmmakers still do to this very day. Coscarelli had met Angus Scrimm on a previous film. Scrimm was already 6'4", but he was made to wear platform shoes and a suit that was 2 sizes too small for him. So it would really exaggerate his body and make him appear larger. He also wrote the film with Michael A. Baldwin, the kid who plays Mike, in mind. He'd worked with Mike in a previous film as well. But one of the film's most iconic images, the floating silver sphere, or sentinel as it would later be called, came to Coscarelli in a dream. Willard Green was the art director of the film. In reality, he was an elderly metalworker, and he designed the spheres themselves, but unfortunately died before the film's release, so he was never able to see his creation actually come to life. The title's a word in any English dictionary, but Coscarelli found it most often in the works of Edgar Allan Poe and thought that it evoked a haunting and gothic sensibility. The original idea was poised by Reggie Bannister, the guy who plays Reggie Bannister. He suggested that Coscarelli make a film adaptation of Something Wicked This Way Comes, the story by Ray Bradbury. Unfortunately, Disney had just acquired the rights, so Coscarelli decided to write his own version of that story. The runtime of the original Phantasm originally clocked in at 4 hours. Obviously, this was trimmed down, but some of the footage was later found in the 90s and used for Phantasm 4 Oblivion. However, a vast majority of the scenes cut from the original film are considered lost. Kate Coscarelli, the director's mother, did makeup, costume design, and production design, and would later go on to write the novelization of the film, but we'll talk about that in a second. The Morningside Mansion is also used in Burnt Offerings and A View to a Kill. All of the dwarves were actually played by children. In Australia, the film is called The Never Dead, and Entertainment Weekly calls Phantasm the 17th scariest movie of all time. One of the prop tombstones that you'll see in the graveyard, because some of those are real, some of those are fake, is for Cecilia Weiss. Cecilia Weiss is the name of the mother of Eric Weiss, who is the man who would later be known to the world as Harry Houdini. Michael Baldwin actually learned how to drive on the set of Phantasm in a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. The film was originally rated X, and initially Angus Scrimm was only told that he would be playing an alien. So, to his theatrical mind, he was wondering what country, what accent, and started working on various European accents in order to be able to step into any immigrant he was asked to play. Only after a couple of weeks did Coscarelli tell him, no, alien is in Alien. Members of the crew and cast of the original Phantasm often play a drinking game called the Dos Equis game. A Dos Equis bottler was one of the investors on the film, so the beer was aplenty on the set. The game goes, every time you see a Dos Equis bottle hidden somewhere in the frame, have yourself a drink. Coscarelli says you'll be drunk in 20 minutes. I didn't really watch Phantasm when I was a kid. I was more of a Freddy, Jason, Chucky sort of guy. But there's a lot to really like about Phantasm. It is sort of ethereal, and as the series goes, it'll just get more and more weird. But there is something to be said about a horror film that's just about a child trying to deal with grief, if you believe that's what the movie's actually about. It seems to be, at least in this first film, how do you cope with losing someone in your life? And that's a cool little concept. It feels like something that This Way Comes. It feels like a more adult version of Goosebumps. It's indie as fuck. And as a filmmaker, I recognize that. I recognize the goofs and the mistakes. A continuous action or a continuous cut is when you're cutting between two things and you want the action to seem seamless. That's the way that cut should go, but a lot of times in Phantasm, the cut goes like this. And it's just that double weird cut that doesn't really make sense, and that happens a lot. For the most part, the story is captivating, and Angus Scrimm is an imposing bad guy, and there's a fairy tale quality to the entire thing that makes it feel kind of special.
The funeral is about to begin.
Phantasm 2 was released in 1988, written and directed by the same guy who wrote and directed Bubba Hotep, starring the narrator from Wishmaster, Sam from the Bear Winch Project, who's also the host of the radio show The Single Life, featuring the German guy who stands up in the first Avengers film, Senator Helen Brucker from Angel, Roach from Point Break, and Bill's dad from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. We pick up at the ending of the first Phantasm film. Tall Man is after Mike, and in order to stop him, Reggie has to set the whole house on fire and destroy it, but still doesn't for some reason believe Mike that the Tall Man was even real. So Mike goes to an institution, an insane asylum for like 7 years. And then we see him getting out. He feigns his sanity. He still believes in the idea of the Tall Man. He just says whatever he needs to say in order to get out, which is really a commentary on the psychiatric system of the United States of America in the late 80s. It's not really. After being released from the institution, Mike goes back to Morningside Cemetery and he starts digging up a grave. And there, Reggie stumbles upon him and is like, "What are you doing, man? You're insane." And Mike's like, "The Tall Man's out there." And Reggie's like, "No, he's not. I sell ice cream." And he shows him all of these graves he's been digging up, and they're all empty. And Reggie's like, "This has got to stop. Let me just take you home. I have a wife and kid at home, and they want to make you dinner." They start driving back to Reggie's house, and on the way, Mike has a premonition. He's like, "Your wife and child are gonna die." And then his house explodes, and his wife and child die. And Reggie's like, "Holy fuck, okay, there is a Tall Man. I'm down." So they break into a hardware store and they get a bunch of weapons. Reggie builds like a 4-barrel shotgun that will become his iconic weapon throughout the entire series. And they decide to go on the road and hunt the Tall Man. And it becomes like this post-apocalyptic buddy movie because every town they go to is just dead. The tall man's already gone through there and has destroyed everything. We also established that Mike has this connection, a psychic connection with this girl named Liz. They see each other in their dreams, and it's sort of like this star-crossed lover sort of thing. Liz's grandfather has died, and she's afraid the tall man is going to take him. Spoiler alert, he does. Priest, who's in charge of this funeral home in Oregon, doesn't want this guy to return from the dead, takes like a knife and like starts desecrating the body, which just means like poking it full of holes so it can breathe, I guess. But it doesn't stop the tall man, because like the next day resurrects the grandpa. Grandpa goes and he steals the grandma, leaves behind like a pin of some sort, and when Liz finds it, she feels the tall man say, "Come and find him, girl." Mike's fallen asleep. Before this, he had like a premonition of like this naked girl on the side of the road, and he wakes up and that girl is in the car. Reggie has stopped to pick her up. This girl's name is Alchemy. They call her Kimmy for short. For some fucking reason, I'm in love with this girl. Liz is really attractive as well, but something about Alchemy is just really fucking hot, and I don't understand it. But Reggie's trying to mac on Alchemy. Liz loses her sister at the funeral home. She's wandering around. She finds the priest, who's kind of drunk, and then a sphere shows up, and the sphere kills the priest. She catches up with Mike and Reggie and them somehow. Mike and Liz are totally gonna bone. You can like feel it. Alchemy's family is from this town, and her uncle had like a bed and breakfast, but her uncle's gone and she had no idea, so it's like this abandoned building. So the four of them decide they're gonna stay in there for the night. So Liz and Mike go off to their own room, Reggie and Alchemy go off to their room. Reggie starts to put the moves on Alchemy, and then Alchemy's like way too fucking intense, and she's just like giddily laughing with her shirt off and bouncing on him, but in a way that's not even sexual, in a way that's like, oh, she mistook this person for a bouncy house. But the tall man shows up and he kidnaps Liz, takes her back to the funeral home. Mike and Reggie decide they have to go after her. Reggie and Mike go into the mortuary after her. They stumble upon an embalming room. Reggie pours acid into the embalming fluid and is like, this will probably come in hand later. And Mike finds a door that can only be opened with one of the spheres, or as they are known, sentinels. Meanwhile, Liz is going to be cremated by one of the tall man's henchmen, who's also dressed like an undertaker. And it's a very similar hairstyle to what you imagine a young tall man would look like. And so Mike and Reggie decide to split up, and they're looking throughout the mortuary to find Liz. Mike finds Liz. Reggie goes into a basement and he's attacked by a graver. Graver is like one of these guys with a gas mask who for some reason works for the tall man. He like has a chainsaw fight with him and saws the guy's balls in half or something like that. Family friendly. And then he gets attacked by a bunch of lurkers, which are the dwarf characters. Liz gets away from the well-dressed undertaker man and she runs into Mike. A sphere comes after that guy. I think it goes in the back of his head and comes out of his mouth, something gross like that. But Mike grabs it and they use it to open that door, which is like another portal room. Then the tall man shows up and tall man starts beating the fuck out of him. Then they put the embalming fluid in him and he starts to melt. They might set the house on fire for good measure. I don't know. That seems like a thing they do in all these movies. And then another hearse pulls up, Alchemy driving. Mike and Liz get in the back, Reggie gets in the side, and Alchemy's like, yeah, I saved the day. And Reggie's like, oh my God, you're so hot. Use me as your bouncy castle. And then her head falls apart. The car stops. Reggie's on the back of the window bashing on it. The hearse pulls away. Mike's looking at Liz and like, this is a dream. This is a dream. And the tall man breaks through the window. No, it isn't. And then the movie ends. This film feels drastically different than the first one. With the first one, it's this like Stand By Me, Goosebumps sort of vibe. This is much more of a post-apocalyptic adventure action horror story. The original film had come out almost a decade prior to this one. And in the meantime, both Michael A. Baldwin and Reggie Bannister had quit acting. Reggie Bannister actually started working as a mortician's assistant. But Universal Studios, who decided to produce and distribute this film, didn't want to hedge their bets on non-actors. They gave Coscarelli a choice. You can either keep Reggie or you can keep Mike, but you can't keep both. One of the people that actually auditioned for the role, Brad Pitt. The film had a budget of $3 million, which was the lowest budget of any Universal produced film in the 1980s, but the highest budget of all of the Phantasm films. The scene where they blow up Reggie's house had to be a controlled scene because they bought the house for like $50 on the condition that they demolish it. That they were loading up all of the explosives, but they were only permitted by the state to use a certain amount. The fire chief kept being very strict about like, no, you guys, you can't put it there. Not on that structure. No, that's too much. That's too much. And after a point, the fire chief asked, what movie is this anyway? The guy said, well, we're doing the sequel to Phantasm. And the fire chief goes, Phantasm? I love Phantasm. Put some more explosives in this shit. Let's just get, how much do you guys got? Put it all on. And that's why the explosion of Reggie's house is so enormous. Coscarelli said the film was heavily influenced by Stephen King's Salem's Lot. And in addition to the universal stipulation that he had to pick between his two main actors, they demanded that there be no ambiguity to the story, no dream sequences, thus the line at the end sort of as a FU, and a love interest be added to the film. Coscarelli's good friend Sam Raimi visited the set, and on the day of Raimi's visit, Coscarelli wanted to have a little Easter egg for him. In the sequence where Liz is about to be murdered by the Undertaker, there's a cremation bag, and you can see the name clearly labeled on the cremation bag as Sam Raimi. But that's not the only cool name. As they're walking through the cemetery, one of the Easter egg tombstones reads Alex Murphy. This is the name of fucking RoboCop. Greg Nicotero, who later go on to Walking Dead fame, and Kurtzman were brought on as the supervisors for the special effects. The Golden Sphere was nicknamed and affectionately called Rambo while on set. And the new look, design, and capabilities of the spheres were influenced by the short story Second Variety by Philip K. Dick. It is much more of that post-apocalyptic vibe that the rest of the series is going to stick with. It is about the tall man slowly taking over America, much less the world. Crucial part to the Phantasm mythos going forward. It's not really something you have in the first one. The first one, the tall man's just sort of like a boogeyman that hides in the shadow. The second one, he becomes a world conqueror. And that's kind of a cool notion. I think the second one is a much more well put together film. By this point, Coscarelli knows what he's doing, and he's got a budget, and all of that fucking shows. To me, the only issue though is that it lacks the charm. It introduces some more of the camp elements that are cool. Reggie's 4-barrel shotgun is awesome. Alchemy, I'm secretly in love with, call me. But that first Phantasm film is so unique. It has its flaws, but it feels personal. It feels almost handmade. With this one, it still has levels of independent to it, but it definitely feels like a more polished franchise installment, as opposed to that first one, which feels like a passion project.
Now you die.
Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead, was released in 1994. Written and directed by the same guy who directed John Dies at the End, starring King Vladislav from the Subspecies series, Brendan from Prehysteria 2, the voice of Croc from the new Batman Adventures, and the lead singer of band Chatter. Now, the film was not produced by Universal, but Universal did distribute it, and though it's largely reported to have been a straight-to-video release, it did see a limited and brief theatrical run, but this is the last Phantasm movie to be shown in theaters. 3 and 4 kind of get confusing, and well, I mean, the whole fucking series is confusing. 3 starts at the ending of 2. Mike and Liz are in the back of the car being driven by alchemy. When they killed the tall man with the embalming fluid filled with acid, we see him die, and we see another tall man walk through the portal. Reggie gets dropped out of the car, but he's not dead. The hearse that Alchemy's driving crash somehow, and it explodes, and he runs. Reggie does, and he gets Mike, but it's a different Mike now. Now it's the Mike from the first one. Michael A. Baldwin is back as Mike now. And we can't find Liz. Oh my god, where's Liz, the love interest that was so important to the last movie? Oh fuck, we turn around and there's the tall man with her fucking head fucking pieces out, yeah? So then Mike, I think he goes to a coma or something for like 2 months. He's in the hospital, Reggie comes to get him, and right before Reggie shows up, Mike wakes up, and there's this demonic nurse that's trying to kill him, and Mike starts beating the shit out of her. I think Reggie might beat the shit out of her as well. Either way, they beat her up, she dies, and then her head explodes, and there's a silver sphere, and it flies the fuck off. They go back to Reggie's house, and I think Jody's there, and they're like, wait a fucking second, Jody's dead from a car crash in the first movie, and Jody's like, well, things aren't what they seem. I'm here to warn you. I'm here to tell you important stuff. And the tall man shows up and like blasts Jody. And Jody turns into like this charred sphere thing and then flies the fuck away. And the tall man draws Mike through like the portal gates with him. Before Jody had disappeared and turned into a sphere, told Mike about a town in Idaho Reggie should go to because potatoes. I don't know. So Reggie wakes up the next morning and fucking decides to go. He's driving his Cuda and he gets accosted by 3 like straight up early 90s robber people. Like it's a gang that doesn't fucking make sense. It's like a hot chick, a buff guy, and like their grandpa are like hanging out, and they're driving a pink hearse, and they beat the shit out of Reggie, and they throw him in the trunk of his own car, and they go to this house. They walk into the house, I guess to loot it. It's basically like the fucking Home Alone kid is there, and he has all these traps set up. And he kills all 3 of these grown-ass adults. And he hears Reggie in the trunk of the car. So he goes and he lets Reggie out. And then they bury the 3 bodies. And then Tim, who's this kid, starts telling Reggie about what's happened. How the tall man came and he destroyed everything. And he killed his parents. And that Tim's dad used to be the sheriff. The next day, they find that all 3 of the bodies they buried yesterday are now gone. And Tim's like, the lurkers must have got them. So this is the first time that we get the nomenclature of what the little dwarf things are called. So they're called lurkers. We've already got gravers. We established that in the last movie. And this movie also tells us the spheres are called sentinels. But they never mention it in any of the other movies. Reggie and Tim start driving off, and they come across like this small house that has all these kids playing outside. Reggie stops for a second to get directions, and then he pays the lady who's watching all these kids, hey, take this little boy. And so he just leaves the little boy and keeps driving. But the little boy's smart. He's a 1990s movie character. So he snuck back into the trunk and is riding along with Reggie. Reggie goes to this mausoleum and he's looking the fuck around. One of the sentinels starts attacking him. These 2 ladies show up, Tanisha and Rocky, who are both in the military and are now out of the military. And Rocky has a pair of nunchucks, which makes her fucking awesome. The sphere, the sentinel starts attacking them. Reggie's like, hey, watch the fuck out. You don't want to fuck with those sentinels. And they're like, shut the fuck up, old man. And then the sentinel kills Reggie. Doesn't kill Reggie. That would be weird. That's the end of the movie. Then the sentinel kills Tanisha. And then Rocky tries to nunchuck it. And then all of a sudden there's a blast. And it's Tim with a gun. And Tim shoots the sentinel and destroys the sentinel. Then the 3 of them are in the car together. They're driving. They're trying to find the tall man. And they see a convoy of gravers driving hearses. They're like, fuck yeah, we'll follow that. That can't go wrong at all. They're like, we're going to stay the night at this hotel. Rocky is a young African-American, gorgeous woman. Reggie looks like me. And Tim is a kid. And this is a post-apocalyptic world. So Reggie's like, hey, Tim, stay in the fucking car. I'm gonna go try to get some strange. And Reggie's trying to put the moves on her. And she's like, shut the fuck up. This is not gonna happen. And Reggie's like, please, which is the universal way that men try to have sex. And Rocky's like, yeah, cool, but we have to do it my way. She pulls out handcuffs. And Reggie's like, fuck yeah, awesome. She handcuffs him to the bed and goes to fucking sleep. Reggie starts to dream. And his dream, I think this is the part where he starts fucking Rocky. He starts having sex with Rocky. It's kind of graphic. And Jody appears. He's like, hey man, not now, I'm kind of busy, dude. And then Jody's like, you need to help me get Mike. In the dream, Jody takes Reggie to go save Mike. So when Reggie wakes up, Mike stumbles out of this portal. And the tall man tries to chase him. Reggie closes off the portal and it cuts off the tall man's hands, right? Yellow blood starts pouring everywhere because that's the color of their blood. 4 of them, Mike, Rocky, Reggie, Tim, go to this mausoleum in Bolton, which I think is the name of the city that Jody was talking about earlier. And they find like this cryogenics facility. And that's when Mike remembers, hey, he didn't like the cold. So they get attacked by all these things, by the looters, lurkers, all sorts of weird birds. They all get separated. Mike finds Jody's ball and has like a psychic link to him. Jody starts telling him sort of that the tall man is trying to conquer dimensions after dimension after dimension, and he has thousands of sentinels ready to attack. It shows him he puts the brains of the lurkers' bodies into the sentinels and then puts them back into their heads so they become like this killer drone. I can feel his connection, and the tall man recaptures Mike, and they like gurney him in, and Mike's trying to reach out and tell everybody, hey, there's thousands of these things. I think he's trying to tell Tim. The tall man knocks him the fuck out. Meanwhile, Reggie, Tim, Rocky, and then the Jody sphere are fighting everybody else off. They run into the embalming room where the tall man is operating on Mike. I think for some reason Rocky has a spear and she dips it in like cryogenic ice stuff and then nitrogen, whatever, and stabs the tall man, but then his head explodes and a golden sphere comes after them. Then Reggie catches it with a plunger and puts it in the cryogenic stuff and it freezes. Mike wakes up and he realizes he's bleeding yellow, and he looks and sees that there's a golden sentinel inside of his head, and his eyes turn silver. So he starts freaking the fuck out and complaining about the cold, and he starts running away, and he's like, leave me alone. Don't come and find me, Reggie. Reggie's like, what the fuck just happened? Jody is like, he says some cryptic shit like, the crocodiles are always smiling, and then turns into a sphere and flies away. Reggie is like, hey, let's go back and look around that mortuary, see if we can find any more details, and Rocky's like, nah, I'm good, peace. Drives away in a hearse. And so it's Reggie and Tim walk back in, and Tim's like, Mike was trying to say something. What was he trying to say? He walks into like the freezer, and the tall man's gone or something like that. Turn around, and Reggie's being held up by hundreds of sentinels, and this like zombie lurker guy jumps up after Tim. Movie ends. Universal demanded the subtitle Lord of the Dead because it felt that the Phantasm series didn't have enough of a following. The last movie was the biggest budget of $3 million. This budget was reduced by about $500,000 to $2.5 million, which is still an enormous budget for the Phantasm movie. The thing I like and frustrates and boggles my mind about this one is it starts to get into these more cerebral aspects of what this horror movie franchise is. 2 kind of started it with the idea of dreams. 3 really takes a fucking Freddy Krueger turn in the fact that we can do things in our dreams that have ramifications in real life, implying maybe that dreams aren't these illusionary things, but maybe we're tapping into another field. Maybe we're tapping into another dimension. And these ideas and notions that you could say are planted in the first movie, that psychic link that we interpret between Mike and Jody in the very first film, those sort of things are heightened. But the question becomes, Jody died in a car crash in the first Phantasm movie. All the other story didn't really happen, did it? So where is this Jody coming? Who is this Jody? What is this Jody? Why the fuck is Mike bleeding yellow? Why the fuck does Mike already have a golden sphere or sentinel in his head? Why do all these women agree to lay in the same bed with Reggie? Phantasm 4, Oblivion, but the IV is like the IV, the Roman numeral, was released in 1998, written and directed by the writer of the stuck-in-development hell Bubba Nosferatu, starring the High Elder from Vampirella, and Callie from Bubba Hotep, and Bubba Hotep himself. The film was a straight-to-video release, and it picks up directly where Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead, ends off. Mike's running away from the mortuary because he fears that some sort of transformation is happening to him, and he's becoming somewhat like the tall man himself. Reggie and Tim have been trapped inside of the mortuary, Reggie by 1,000 different or hundreds of different sentinels, and Tim, well, we don't know what happens to Tim. Tim is just sort of gone from this movie, and nobody ever mentions him. But a new tall man shows up, and the tall man says, Reggie, I'm gonna let you fucking go because the final game has now begun. Which is a weird, ominous, why didn't you just kill him? Why didn't you just kill him and the final game could have ended? That's what this could have been. Mike, meanwhile, is driving off into the desert. Reggie's driving down the highway, and he sees a hitchhiker named Jen, and he stops and he picks up Jen. They decide to crash at an abandoned hotel. They get in bed together, even though it's an abandoned hotel, so there are multiple rooms. They decide to stay together. She doesn't really believe the whole tall man story, but she's like, yeah, I'll sleep in the same bed as this guy. Reggie is super creepy and rapey and trying to do stuff, and she says no. So he eventually respects that until like near the morning, and he tries again and starts feeling her up while she's asleep, which is fucked up. And then he undoes her shirt and reveals that instead of breasts, she has sentinels there, and they start attacking him. I think he like bashes her head in or something like that. He beats both of the fucking sentinels. Meanwhile, Mike is going off into the desert, and he's having like a sort of midlife crisis, and he's remembering all of this stuff from the first film. The original cut of the very first Phantasm was like 3 hours long, but all that footage was lost for years until the 90s when they started making this movie. So they cut pieces that were deleted scenes into this film. So you have like all of these flashbacks that sort of make this film feel fleshed out. So Mike is aware that he's changing, he's becoming something like the tall man, so he decides to go kill himself. So he goes to hang himself, and we have a flashback of a moment when Jody and Mike tried to hang the tall man in the first movie. Although in the first movie, we didn't actually see that. So it's contradictory to the story that we know. But at the same time, remember, the first movie might not have actually happened. It was supposedly a dream. In that past, Mike had cut the tall man down. In this present, the tall man cuts Mike down and says, "You can't kill yourself. You belong to me." And then sort of like fucks off again. Meanwhile, Mike starts to realize that he has telepathic powers, and he crushes one of the dwarfs, one of the lurkers, and then starts taking apart his car and building his own version of a sphere in it, right? Jody shows up, and he goes on some adventures with Jody or some shit like that. They go to all these different places, like a sunset or something. And Mike's like, "You abandoned me." And then eventually they go through one of those portal gates, and it takes them into the late 1860s. I got a dog here. Oh, the fuck over me. And there, he's at the Morningside Mortuary, and he meets the fortune teller from the first movie. It's not actually the same person, but she's dressed like it. Jedediah Morningside. Jedediah Morningside is the tall man, but here he's affable, he's nice, he's dressed really dapper. Jedediah Morningside is like, "You come through the gates. There's so many things you can tell us." And Mike freaks the fuck out and goes back into it. He also has a vision of a battlefield, and Jedediah Morningside is working on Mike, and you see all these soldiers and all this stuff, whatever. More confrontations with Jody. Mike is doing his like Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi work. He decides to go back again with Jody, even though Jody tells him this won't work. He's gonna go back and stop Jedediah from becoming the tall man. He goes back again to the 1860s, but now Jedediah can't see him. And we see Jedediah has like the science lab, but like a steampunk sort of style, where he's doing all these concoctions and experiments, all this stuff, and he walks through these rudimentary versions of the portal. Gone, he vanishes, and then he comes back and he's now the tall man. But when the tall man comes back through, he can see Mike. And it almost gives you the feeling that this is their first canonical interaction. That Mike, as an adult, wouldn't remember this, obviously, so he thinks the first time he's met the tall man is as a child. But the tall man remembers this moment. There's this moment of like, in his eyes, of like, "Oh, you're gonna be my adversary." And then Mike and Jody go through the portal. I keep saying Jedediah or Jebediah. I don't know which one it is. I think it's Jebediah? Jebediah. His name was Jebediah. I might have been saying Jedediah or Jeffediah. I don't know what the fuck I've been saying, but it's Jebediah. Mike and Jody come back out of the portal, and there's Reggie. Reggie's found them in the middle of Death Valley. Mike runs up to Reggie and gives him a hug and is like, "Don't trust Jody." And Reggie's like, "I'm sorry, what?" Mike and Jody go back through the portal. Then they're in a graveyard, and Mike finds Jody, and he confronts Jody, and he's like, "Hey, you were a dick to me, and I know you're not really my fucking brother." And then Jody attacks Mike, and Mike beats the shit out of Jody. And then another Jody attacks Mike. And then that second Jody grabs Mike and takes him through the portal, and all of a sudden, he's in a fucking mortuary, and the tall man and Jody are carving up his skull again. But somehow Mike has a tuning fork that he got from Reggie, and he hits it. When he hits it, Jody and the tall man both freeze, and he hits it again, and it makes tall man take one of the sentinels with a buzzsaw and kill Jody. So then Mike escapes, and he's back in Death Valley, and Reggie's like, "What the fuck just happened?" And then the tall man comes out of the portal. Mike uses his powers, and the hood of his car pops up, and a sentinel flies out that he's built, and it goes after the tall man, and the tall man destroys it. And he's like, "Oh, you think that's going to stop me?" And Mike's like, "Nope." And then you realize that it wasn't just the Sentinel he built. He made the entire car's engine into an interdimensional bomb, because he knows how to do that, I guess. The interdimensional bomb blows up, and it kills the tall man. Reggie's like, "Holy fuck," and Mike's like, "Holy fuck." And then another tall man walks out. The other tall man just walks right up to Mike, rips his head open, grabs a golden sphere out of his head, and then walks the fuck back off. And Reggie decides he's going to go after the tall man. So Reggie gets his 4-barrel shotgun and starts going after the tall man. And remember, we've been cutting back and forth, the past and now. In the past, we see a young Mike hitching a ride on Reggie's ice cream truck. And like, Mike and Reggie's last lines in the present are something like, "I'll come back for you. No, you will." That's not really what it is, but it seems like that sort of dramatic flair. While Reggie and Mike are riding in this ice cream truck in the middle of the darkness of the 1970s, and it's all quiet and perfectly still, they hear that distant echo of those lines. They're hearing themselves in the future. One of them looks at the other and goes, "Did you hear that?" And the other one says, "Oh, it's just the wind." And they drive off into the darkness. It's weird, right? It's a weird, fucking cerebral sort of ending. So this movie's budget was cut down from the $2.5 million to about $500,000 in total. It was originally entitled Phantasm Forever, but spelled Phorever. In the script, we see what happens to Tim, and he's eaten by dwarves. Roger Avery, who worked on the Robert Zemeckis Beowulf and a bunch of Quentin Tarantino films, originally wrote a script called Phantasm's End, which took the series into that super post-apocalyptic world, and Don Coscarelli absolutely fucking loved it. But it was so expensive they couldn't get anybody to finance it. So instead, what he did was he took a couple of elements from that script, wrote them into this script, and used this as a prequel, intending to eventually make that film. But that sadly never actually happened. So when you see the Civil War scenes, the vast majority of the Civil War soldiers were actually Civil War reenactors that volunteered to do the film, as their organization got a donation of $200. And a lot of the Sphere and Sentinel work is actually fan-produced. Fans chipped in to do some of the heavy lifting on the computer graphics in order to make sure that this film actually happened. Although KNBFX, who worked on the second film, did come back and do a couple of things as a favor to Coscarelli. I think, like, this movie benefits so fucking much from the finding of the footage from the first one. It really makes everything feel like it's planned and gives it a more epic scope. This idea of the Phantasm story going throughout time and all in time and dreams and consciousness and space. Like, spoiler alert, you're never gonna get like a really good explanation for what's happening, but every Phantasm movie contributes to deepening the mystery ever so slightly. I really, really dig this one. This is definitely my favorite ending of any of the Phantasm movies. I feel the ending is very bittersweet and ominous and interesting and compelling. Super fucking well edited. Phantasm 5 Ravager was a straight-to-DVD release in 2016, directed by the same guy that directed My Friends Tigger and Pooh and Transformers Prime. But it has a lot of different, like, cameos that if you blink twice, you won't see. And those cameos include Dr. Leslie Arts from the television show Lost, this guy who used to do promotions for Full Moon Pictures, the director of Justice League Flashpoint Paradox. This guy appears as a gravedigger, but he also does special effects for movies like Birds of Prey, The Hunger Games, and television shows like Justified. In a deleted scene, Derek Mears, the guy who played Swamp Thing, appeared as a dwarf creature that was not so dwarfish, but that was a deleted scene, so whatever. Okay, this movie is the single most confusing out of all of them, and multiple storylines are happening at once, and they're interconnecting. So what I'm going to try to do is separate the storylines and tell you, this is what's happening in this world, this is what's happening in this world, this is what's happening in this world. 5 picks up with Reggie wandering around the desert, coming back from wherever he went at the end of 4. He's still in his ice cream uniform. He's obviously aged a little bit, but not as intensely as he's aged in other moment. He still has his 4-barrel shotgun, but he can't find his Cuda. Goes out onto the highway. He sees somebody driving his Cuda, asks for a ride, and then, while trying to give the guy some cash, kicks the guy out. He's like, this is my fucking car, and I know it. Get the fuck out of my car. 2 sentinels start attacking. 1 sentinel destroys this guy, and another sentinel keeps going after Reggie. Reggie's changed clothes and stolen the clothes of the dude who had stolen his car, sort of like a car man sort of thing. As he's driving, he comes across a young lady named Dawn who's broken down on the side of the road. He picks Dawn up in Reggie fashion and starts macking on her pretty hard and telling her about the tall man. And she's like, this is bullshit. Hey, why don't you come stay at my farmhouse? Reggie, starts writing her a song. She tells him to sleep on the couch. She's gonna go to bed. She lives on a farm with a Belarusian, Ukrainian, Yugoslavian, some dude named Demeter lives there as well with her as a farmhand. And she goes to bed. Then, like, halfway through the night, she's like, you know, maybe I do want some of that Reggie dick. So she goes back downstairs to wake Reggie up to get the Reggie dick. Reggie's asleep. So no Reggie dick for her. She goes back to bed. He wakes up in the morning, senses something's off. So he goes upstairs. He finds her dead. Sphere's killing her. I think it's 1 sphere. And then he takes off running, and he runs into a barn. And there's Demeter swinging an axe. There's a language barrier. And then outside, Reggie sees that another one of the spheres kills a horse. And it's kind of brutal. Sentinel comes in and it kills Demeter. Reggie starts running away, shooting it. I think he shoots it. And he sees a giant sentinel in the air. I think he goes through some gates. That Reggie gets confronted by the tall man, and the tall man's like, we've been fighting for a long time. We can stop this fight. I can give you everything you want. I can give you your family back. Just stop fighting me. And Reggie's like, it's bullshit, man. I want Mike and I want Jody back. And the tall man's like, more than your wife and kids? That's fucked up. He doesn't actually say that, but that's what I said while watching it. The tall man's like, no! Mike and Jody are mine! God damn your loyalty! Christ's last temptation sort of thing. Then we see Reggie in a mortuary and he's attacked by some dwarves. And then the lady in lavender shows up. My favorite lady in lavender scene of all time because she's like floating. And this is a special effect they do really well in the movie. And like her toenail is dragging across the floor. It's pretty fucking epic. And I think Reggie shoots her in the face or some shit. And then he goes into like a cave, fights another dwarf thing. The place starts shaking. There's an earthquake. Then he's like standing on top of like this hell rock. Well, it looks like it's from Bill and Ted Bogus Journey. The tall man offers him salvation again. And Reggie's like, no, man, I sell ice cream. Dig? This old man's like, chances are depleting. So that's one story. But the thing that pisses a lot of people off about this movie is there's multiple stories happening at the same time. And they all involve Reggie. They all beg you to ask what's reality and what's not reality. Because while we're seeing that story, we're also cutting to Reggie in an old folks' home. Because he has dementia. And he's fantasizing about the tall man in the entire Phantasm saga. And Mike is there. And Mike is holding his hand saying, it's gonna be okay. You know, ever since my older brother died, you've been there for me, and I'm gonna be there for you. And we see Reggie in the hospital trying to cope with what's real. I gotta get out of here. But he's older now, and his hair is gray. Sometimes he's just wandering around the hospital. And he's telling Mike about his dreams that he's having, about that other Reggie, and a different Reggie who we'll get to in a second. Actually, two more Reggie. And then eventually Mike says, I'm sharing this dream with you, looking for you in the middle of a desert, and I can't find you. Your dream is affecting me. And so Reggie thinks, oh, Mike still has that connection to the tall man. We see another version of Reggie that's in a hospital in the middle of the Civil War. And beside him is Jebediah Morningside, who would later become the tall man. And in this moment, he's talking to Jebediah, and Jebediah is like, we're nearing the end of time. It's almost over. We're going to die, and they've left us here alone. And then Reggie looks away and looks back, and he's sort of grafted with the lady in lavender. And they've threatened him, and then Reggie wakes up, and he's in a different world. And then we have a fourth world, Reggie in a post-apocalyptic future. He wakes up and he's on a gurney and he's about to be operated on, and these two people that look like gravers come in. One of them's like a dwarf graver looking sort of dude, and they let him go. They take off their masks and they're human. The little person's name is Chunk. The taller person takes off their mask and it looks exactly like Dawn. Her name is Jane, and they're a part of the resistance to the tall man. And he starts talking about how I've met you before. I know you, but your name was Dawn. I wrote you a song. And she's like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Let's get you some medical attention. So they take him to get medical attention and meet with the rest of the team. And the rest of the team is led by a different version of Mike. Here, Mike is like John Connor. The tall man took over everything. He wiped it out with a plague. He wiped out most of humanity with a plague. And they're going to go outside. Reggie says something like, I can't wait to see outside again. I miss it. And Mike's like, this is not the world you know. And he opens the door and the skies are red. The tall man has terraformed this area to be what he wants. The Sentinels show up and they start attacking everybody. Tall man shows up and he kidnaps Jane, and he takes Jane to his world. Mike and Reggie are gonna go get Jane back. So they go through the gateway, and there's like a standoff in the tall man's world. And they're separated by like a chasm. The tall man's holding Jane here. Reggie and Mike are over here. Mike's like, give her to me, and he starts to activate his like telekinesis or whatever. And then the tall man kills Jane, and then Chunk is there, disguised as one of the lurkers. And he rips his thing off and he has a bomb on it and he explodes, killing this version of the tall man. Reggie and Mike, get out of and go back to their worlds. Remember, the entire time, we're cutting in between these stories and they're intersecting. In the post-apocalyptic world, then he wakes up and he's in his hospital. Then he wakes up and he's in the desert. Then he wakes up and he's in the Civil War period. End of the film, he's wandering around the hospital and he goes outside and these realities begin to blend. And he starts seeing gravers coming after him. And Mike's there, and then they're fighting off the gravers. Could be hospital employees. And then all of a sudden, a CUDA shows up, and Jody's driving it. And it's all decked out with machine guns and shit like that. And Jody's like, get the fuck in. Reggie gets in the back seat, and they drive off. They're gonna go north because the tall man hates cold. Now we're cutting between this moment and in the hospital as Reggie is dying. But while Reggie's in the hospital, we see Mike beside him holding his hand. On the other side, we see Jody holding his hand. Reggie, we assume, dies in the hospital world and finally gets some rest in the back seat in this post-apocalyptic world. So there's a post-credits scene that shows a portal in the desert opening, and Chunk crawls out missing a fucking hand. Somebody helps him up, and it's Rocky. Chunk's like, did I miss the rendezvous? Oh, and yeah, can I get laid with you? And then Rocky's like, well, you're the only guy around, which is a weird. And then all of a sudden the CUDA pulls up. Chunk jumps in, and Rocky jumps in, and there's something like, move over, old man. And they get in the car and keep driving north. forth. So this film was shot almost entirely in secret. In 2008, it actually started as a web series that was supposed to center on the adventures of Reggie, but obviously it evolved into a full-length feature film. But you can tell some of the footage that was used through over the years, because there were moments when Reggie has old age makeup on, but there's some moments when you can just tell he's aged naturally, and that's, you know, why. In 2005, New Line Cinema was in talks to do a reboot of Phantasm that would focus on Mike, a more of a coming-of-age story, a la It or something like that. It's said that while they were filming the main chunk of this film in 2016, a nosy ice cream truck kept bothering them during shoots, which is sort of ironic given what Reggie's character history is. A lot of fans didn't like this movie, because it takes some of the ideas of Phantasm, some of the more cerebral concepts, and really starts to explore them. And it leaves it open for sort of interpretation. I would argue that that's sort of the aspect that Phantasm's always had above all of the horror franchise. Apart from maybe 2, all of the other Phantasm movies, and even 2 has like the dream element to it, but all the Phantasm movies sort of leave you with a lot of questions. And maybe a lot of fans didn't like this movie because it doesn't answer a lot of those questions. It gives you a bunch of different options. Reggie is just fucking insane and has dementia, but I argue against that one because Mike is the person who says, in the beginning, you were there with me ever since Jody died. And in Reggie's dementia world, Jody's there beside him. And maybe that's a sentimental idea. I think it lends towards something else that the Phantasm series has sort of always danced around the periphery of. That's multiple dimension. In science, we have this idea of parallel worlds, of parallel universes, of the multiverse, of M-layer world. And that's multiple worlds on top of each other, where different possibilities have happened. So if we imagine there is a world where the first Phantasm movie actually happened, Jody not dying, it was Tommy, there was no car crash, the tall man really was a threat. That's happened in multiple worlds. One of those worlds is the one in which they trap him in the mine. One of those worlds is the one in which they hang him. And one of those worlds, Jody did die in a car accident. And that's sort of the way we've played throughout the entire series. That when we see Jody in part 4, it's not our world's Jody, it's a different world's Jody. That Mike with the gold sphere is from a different world where he had a different past. But there are those places and those moments where the parallel universes get too close to each other. When the veil is thin and you can sort of interact, or your consciousness shifts from one world to the other. And one would argue that's what's happening in 5, is that Reggie is experiencing multiple versions of himself throughout the multiverse. And in one world, the tall man has completely won. In one world, he still has a chance to fight him. In one world, Reggie lived in the same time as Jebediah Morningside. And in one world, all of this is a delusion. And all of those worlds exist simultaneously. And the tall man seeks to eliminate all of those worlds. And this is why there are a plethora of tall men. He's almost, to use a phrase from Marvel, a nexus being. He exists in every single reality. Or he's made himself exist in every reality. You know, after he comes through the first gate, he goes and he finds every Jebediah Morningside because he sees him as an appropriate vessel. I know, that's a lot. But that's kind of why I like this movie, because it brings those questions. The movie is cheaply made, but the story is kind of there. There's kind of this interesting plot line that happens. It's not typical, it's not mainstream by any means. It is interesting. And I think the thing Phantasm does better than its filmmaking is pique your interest by concepts, by ideas. Indonesian production company Rapi Films purchased the rights to remake Phantasm, and in 1980 they released Pengabdi Setan, or Satan's Slave. Now, oftentimes when we think of remakes, we think of something that's a shot for shot, or adheres almost exclusively to the story. We think of our own remakes like Carrie to Carrie, or things we've gotten from other countries, like Let the Right One In to Let Me In, or Ju-On to The Grudge. It follows the same plot point. Maybe it has a few more injected or takes a turn somewhere, but it's almost the same film. But that's not always the case. Sometimes remakes or adaptations are sort of loosely based on the source material, or just inspired by it. There's an Anthony Hopkins movie called Instinct. It's based on the, I think it's Daniel Quinn novel Ishmael, and it's nothing like the fucking book. But still, they purchased the rights to that book so they can make that movie. And the same sort of thing happens kind of with Satan's Slave. If you watch it and you're aware that it's a Phantasm remake, every now and then you'll see those moments like, okay, I guess they kind of got that. Okay, I guess they kind of used this. But it's very, very loose. So it's set in Indonesia in 1980 we have a nuclear family. Morty is the mom. Munarto is the dad, Rita is the oldest child, she's the daughter, she's like a teenager, and Tommy is the boy, he's maybe like 14, 13, something around that, sort of like the Mike equivalent. But when the film starts, Muwarti, the mother, has passed away. So we begin at the funeral, and everyone is practicing their Islamic prayers. The family, the dad, daughter, son, they go back home to mourn the loss of the maternal figure. But it seems like it was a death that was coming for a while. It wasn't unexpected. She was sick, all that jazz. Dad is sort of work obsessed, and they have this really nice house. I think it's a nice house. I don't know if it's a nice house. My assumption of what makes a nice house is multitudes of rooms, and this house has more than 4. So I'm like, oh, that's fucking really fancy. Grew up in poverty. That's what I did. Rita has, for some reason, in her room, a picture of some chick in a bikini, which is totally fine, but it just catches you off guard. It's like a picture of a chick in a bikini and her mom, and then Tommy has like a tiger riding lightning, I guess. Maybe he's a Neo fan, I don't know. But that night, Tommy sees the spirit of his mother outside of his window and follows her, but he doesn't talk to her. Rita sees him wandering outside, but doesn't see the mom. Also have a guy who works for them, Mr. Carto, who is like super religious, but also has really bad asthma, but he's scared of like ghosts and stuff like that. So Tommy tells somebody that he saw his mom, and they tell him, hey, you should go see this fortune teller. And the fortune teller tells him that you're all in grave danger. You need to use black magic to sort of fortify your house. Tommy starts getting really into black magic, and we kind of established that the family is atheist, or agnostic at least. Meanwhile, Rita's boyfriend, a guy named Herman, comes around, and he's talking about how for 40 days after they bury the dead can come around. Which is a creepy fucking thing to say to someone whose mom just died like yesterday. And then in the middle of like a family dinner, there's a knock on the door. This lady named Darmina shows up. She was apparently sent by a friend of the family to help them take care of the house in their time of mourning. So that night, Rita goes to like a party, which is like a really cool party scene, and Rita sees a kuntilanak. And a kuntilanak is a like Indonesian vampire ghost spectral sort of form. And it might be her mom, we don't know. Kind of looks like Darmina. So she sees that, she gets scared. She tells Herman, I think, and Herman's like, I think it's that Darmina bitch. Can't be trusting her. Look, I can go get a shaman, and the shaman can sort all this out. Meanwhile, Mr. Carto, he's trying to tell the dad, look, something weird's going on here. I think Darmina's involved with it. Dad's like, no, she's not. Tommy is getting more and more into the occult and black magic and stuff like that. He goes to like a bookstore, and he runs into a Kiai who runs the newsstand. A Kiai is like, within the Javanese culture, is an expert in Islam. So it's almost like a guru, like a fatherly priest-like sort of figure. A Kiai tells him, I can sense that you're burdened. You need to say your prayers. And he's like, I don't pray. We don't do that sort of thing. And the Kiai's like, well, maybe you need to fucking try. I don't think he says fuck it. Tommy goes home, and he tries to say his prayers, and then the Kuntilanak shows up again. And I think Tommy, like, he screams, and his dad comes in with Mr. Carto, and they're like, you gotta stop this shit. And the next day, Tommy finds Mr. Carto hung. Previously, they had like a weird asthma attack happen, but now he's hung and he can't breathe at all because he's dead. Rita's boyfriend, Herman, is on the way to see a shaman, and he's driving in his motorcycle, and he sees Darmina, and he has to swerve to get out of her way. And when he does that, he wrecks into a truck and dies instantaneously. That night, dead Herman visits Rita. The next morning, they tell their dad, we have to get a shaman. We have to do something. So the next day, the dad calls a shaman, and the shaman comes and is sort of like doing an exorcism on the house when like glass starts shattering and chasing him, and flowers start chasing him. The chandelier breaks off of the ceiling and starts spinning, much like a sentinel from the Phantasm film, and impales him in the head. And then he dies. So they've killed the fucking shaman as well. I guess they're cleaning up the body, and we see Darmina sneak out, and Tommy follows her. And he follows her into the cemetery, and she meets up there with undead Herman and undead Mr. Carto. And they go to Muwarti, his mother's grave. And Muwarti starts rising from the fucking grave. And it's a cool scene because she's just floating. And then he like interrupts them or something, and she just falls. And the way she falls looks so fucking painful because she hits her own grave. And it looks just excruciating. He runs home and he tells his dad and his sister what he just saw. And his sister believes him, and his dad like, that's bullshit. It didn't happen. Let's go prove it. So he opens Darmina's room, the door to her room, and she's sitting there because she has like her own wing of the house. Because this house has a lot of fucking rooms. So then the next night, the siblings go back to the graveyard and they dig up their mother's grave to make sure that she's still there. I don't remember if they actually see her or not. They go back to the house and they tell the dad, because the dad's like, where have you been? What have you been doing? They start crying. It's an intense scene. I think they all go to bed and then all of them get attacked. Mawarty comes back from the dead and attacks the dad. Herman comes back from the dead and attacks Rita. Mr. Cardo comes back from the dead and attacks Tommy, but also like throws a body in Tommy's bed, and it's a vision of Tommy himself, right? Scary shit. And then Darmina's there and they decide to run out of the house. They're gonna escape finally, and when they get there, there is the Kyai, the religious leader is there, and he's got the entire village, and they start saying prayers. And then you realize that this demon feeds upon people's lack of faith when they're most vulnerable. And so the prayers sort of like make the zombies just drop dead, and then Darmina bursts into flames. And then we see the family going to the mosque, and they're leaving the mosque, and they're getting back into their car. And as they get into their car, another car pulls up beside them, and it's some dude in the passenger seat, and Darmina's driving. And then that's the end of the film. For years and years, this film wasn't really readily available outside of a Japanese VHS that had no subtitles or dubbing, but it was an Indonesian classic. It's considered a horror staple of that culture. It doesn't bear a lot of resemblance to Phantasm. It still deals with some of the issues of like, how do we cope with death? It does have such a Muslim lean to it. It's one of the only films I think I've ever seen, maybe I've seen like one or two in a religious class, that is like, hey, this is the power of Islam. You need it to keep your soul safe. We see that in Christian films all the time, but it's sort of like refreshing and interesting to see it in a horror film, right? I will say that it's very similar to Phantasm in that dreamlike quality, and I think, and I know somebody's gonna bitch about this, just from a pure cinematic standpoint, it's a better made film than the first Phantasm. The camera work is super competent, the cuts are awesome. It's just a well-made fucking film. It's definitely a product of its time, but it's well made. And at times, the atmosphere is very akin to like a Hammer horror film. It's not about jump scares. It's not about how creepy the boogeyman is. Can you imagine watching someone bring your mother back from the dead to kill you? I actually really like the movie. I think it's a lot of fun. I don't think it has the same iconic imagery Phantasm does. I don't think it's as weird as Phantasm is story-wise, but I do think it finds a way to play on all those motifs that Phantasm is exploring, but through a different cultural lens. The 1980 Pengabdi Setan was remade in 2017 by Rapi Films, the Indonesian production company. In the United States, it was distributed by Shudder as a Shudder exclusive, and Pengabdi Setan means Satan's slaves. Directed by the same guy who directed Gundala, and starring Maya from Impedagor, the film takes the premise of the first movie and sort of changes it ever so slightly. So let's reintroduce ourselves to the family that we have in this 2017 version that's set in 1981. We have the mother, Mawarni. The father's name is now Bari. There's a grandmother in a wheelchair by the name of Rama. The oldest daughter's name is now Rini. 16-year-old son is named Tony. There's another son named Bondi. And then we have the youngest son, who is 6, about to turn 7, Ian. Ian is mute but communicates through sign language with the rest of his family. At the beginning of this film, Mawarni is still alive. She's just deathly sick, and we know that her death is imminent. But it also establishes that she was a singer, was her career, and she was sort of a famous singer in her country. But she hasn't been able to sing in years because of the sickness. She can't even communicate. She can't speak at all. I'm gonna sneeze. Oh fuck. The sneeze went away. No! It was a Phantasm sneeze! But rather than being able to speak anytime she needs something, she rings a bell. And her sickness has destroyed the family, not necessarily emotionally, because they're all super tight, but financially. They've gone sort of into ruin. They're having to sell things. At the beginning of the movie, it starts with Rini in Jakarta. They live outside of Jakarta, but she's in Jakarta into the city trying to get royalties from her mother's records. And they're like, there's just no... yeah, there's nothing. You've gone dry. Tony drives a motorcycle funeral, but this movie begins with him having to sell his motorbike so that they can afford to pay bills and all that stuff. So the mother is basically an invalid upstairs. You also have the grandmother who's confined to a wheelchair. The family are just struggling to get by. The brother brushes his mother's hair. The sister, Rini, makes food for everybody. So they each have their sort of place within the family. One night, Rini sees her mother standing up, and her mother hasn't stood up in years. So she obviously freaks the fuck out. Then her mother collapses. The dad rushes in and is like, she's gone, guys. I'm sorry, she's gone. And then a heartbreak, and then we start to see the funeral. We're introduced to a local ustad, which is like it's an honorary title for a person who's well versed in the faith. And the ustad has a son, and his son's name is Hindra, and he starts flirting with Rini at her mother's funeral. One of the youngest brothers is like, after 40 steps away from the grave, the dead wake up. So he doesn't want to finish walking those 40 steps because he doesn't want his mother to live that sort of abysmal, dark life, right? So the next day after the funeral, Bari, the dad, has to leave to go into the city to settle some of their financial disputes, try to see what he can do now that his wife has passed. When he leaves that night, the two younger sons start experiencing paranormal sort of activity, and they're seeing a lady. The Hindra tells Rini, while he's macking on her, and this is a weird way to mack on somebody, that I saw somebody in your house that looked like your mom. I know your mom's dead, so it has to be something else that's sort of taking her form. Everybody's having these sort of supernatural sort of moments. We see the grandmother, who's wheelchair bound, writing a letter, and then we see her standing up and freaking out. And then the next thing we know, Rini and Bondi are finding the grandmother dead in the well that they have, that they get all their water from. We then go to the funeral, and then after the funeral, Rini finds the letter that the grandmother was writing. The letter was to a guy named Budiman. So they go to see Budiman, and he reveals that he was a friend of the grandmother since they were like children. He knows all about their family and all that stuff. And he says that when your dad was younger, your grandmother didn't approve of his relationship with your mom. You know, artists, she was a singer, artists were sort of seen as improper, and people thought that she was infirm until she had you 5 kids. Your 5 kids are sort of like a miracle that she even had you. Here's this work that I did that I think you might be interested in. They go back to Rini's house, and Tony finds the magazine because Rini didn't even fucking bother to read it. And it says there was this cult that worshipped Satan that allowed barren women to have children. But the deal was, you could have as many kids as you want, but on the 7th birthday of the last kid you have, it's given up to Satan. Tony starts to think, maybe our fucking mom was a member of this satanic cult. Because he starts remembering that when he was young and had to go to all of her concerts, he would always see these people in black suits that never intermingled with anybody else in the crowd. They would just show up to her concerts as this watchers that never spoke to anyone or anything like that. There's also in the article this implication that the husband is not the father of the children, but members of the cult will father each children. And Tony's like, we all look different. None of us kids look alike, you know what I mean? They are told by the ustad that they should pray. They are, like in the original movie, sort of agnostic atheists. They don't really pray, but they try that night, and then all sorts of ghostly shit starts happening, and they get scared, so they run to the ustad's house. So the ustad lives close by. Him and Hindra, what the fuck's the guy's name? Him and Hindra are like, hey, we'll protect you. So they stay there the night. The next morning, Hindra's like, I have this feeling. I'm gonna go see that Budiman guy one more time, and I'm gonna try to talk to him about what's going on. So he goes and he sees him, and the Budiman's like, I'm not talking to you, but here's this note. Take it to Rini. Hindra starts to leave, and he has an accident. The same way the accident happened before, except for we don't have the Darmina character, but it's like he hits a truck, and it's a very emotional scene where they bring his body back to the ustad's house, and the ustad's running out, crying, and it goes slow motion. And as they're bringing his body in, he drops the note. Rini finds it. Later that night, so a haunting starts happening at the ustad's house, right? And it's this weird scene where the kids are sort of by themselves and they're terrified because this thing is chasing them in this new house. And the ustad, my favorite fucking sequence from it, the ustad sees this, and rather than help, rather than be like the guy in the first movie who says the prayers to kill it, closes his door. It's not because he's a coward, it's because he's so in fucking grief. And then maybe there's a cowardice thing to it. Maybe he doesn't know, maybe he thinks they're faking it. I don't know. It's this beautiful, complex scene. Anyway, the dad comes home, he finds them at Ustad's house, he takes them home to their house. This huge fucking poltergeist event starts happening. Doors are shaking, things are breaking, all that stuff. And these people start gathering around their house, all in black suits with black umbrellas. And they're just like standing there watching. And they're reminiscent of the people that Tony used to see when he was a kid. And this spirit thing is trying to get Ian out of the house and pull him out. But Bodhi eventually saves him. It's also interesting because Ian's been mute until this moment. And he starts fucking talking. And that's creepy as shit. They finally threaten all the umbrella people. The umbrella people just open out their hands and drop dirt all around the house. The next day, they're like, fuck this place, we're getting out of here, we're gonna move to Jakarta. They get a flat there, but they're waiting on this truck to come, a moving truck, to come grab them. And it's just like an awesome montage of this them just being happy. The next day will be Ian's 7th birthday. So their plan is to go move everything in and then at midnight go get him ice cream and cake and all that stuff, right? So it's a cool like little family moment. And we sort of confront the idea that the dad's not actually their dad, but he's like, you're my kids and I love you no matter what. Rini finally reads the other paper and it says something to the effect of, the last child isn't just a sacrifice to Satan, it is the child of Satan. The truck that was supposed to come and pick them up never comes to pick them up. It's getting late. Ustad stops in and he asks if he can stay there for a little while just because he's lonely. And then they have a blackout. You know, everybody goes back to their rooms and they're sleeping and all that stuff. And then fucking zombies attack. In the dad's bed, Moarni shows up and she's all zombified. And all these other zombies are trying to break into the fucking house. And they kill Ustad, like right in front of the family. And then they grab Ian and they take Ian outside. So the family goes and they see that Ian is there with his mother and he's talking. He's like, hey, come on, Dad, this is fun. You should come join us. And they go back in the fucking house. They're trying to get away and the zombies are trying to break through. But they see that the door won't budge. And they look in the mirror and it's the ghost of the grandmother that's trying to stop them. And then they hear a fucking car and they run out thinking it's the truck, but it's not, it's Buddhaman. And they jump in the car and they just fucking leave Ian. The Buddhaman guy's like, he's not your son. He never was your son. But you lived like 7 fucking years with this kid. You have to have some sort of emotional attachment. So they leave, and the next thing we see is that they've got like a small apartment in the city. It's a year later. There's a knock on the door, and this lady's like, hey, I have some extra food if you guys want it. Here you go. Enjoy your meal. And Rini takes the food. She's like, thank you so much. Closes the door. Family sits together. They're all eating. They're being a family again. And then we follow that other girl into her apartment. Her boyfriend is there, or some guy is with her, and is like, did they take it? And then she's like, yeah, the sacrifice will happen soon. The guy's like, good job, Darmina. And we realize this is Darmina. And then they start doing this weird, uncomfortable, sensual dance thing. And that's how the movie ends. This is technically supposed to be, or when they created it, they said it was a sequel slash prequel slash remake of the original film. And it kind of fits all of those categories and kind of doesn't fit any of them at the same time. It's just a retelling. It's definitely much further away from Phantasm than that first one was. But I feel I have to say it, because the last one was a remake of Phantasm, and this is a remake of the remake, you know what I mean? In fact, this actually started a trend of remakes all throughout Indonesia. Remakes of films from the 80s. It's lasted from 2017 till currently. They're still in that sort of phase. It is the highest grossing Indonesian horror film of all time. It is the 6th highest grossing Indonesian film period of all time. When it was originally released, it was just released in Indonesia, and they wanted to see how well it did before it went international. But it had such a positive response, they decided to go global with it. But the poster for the film, when released internationally, is actually a fan-made poster that they loved so much. They thought, let's go with this, it's a great design. Joko Anwar, the director of the film, said that for the zombie scene, he hired 24 extras to be the undead. When they went back to watch the film and they were cutting it, even though they'd only hired 24 extras, they found 26 in almost every frame. They don't know who the other 2 were. A sequel was initially planned that would take place in between this film and the original film, but no word about that in the past couple of years. Like, this movie, it caught me off guard because I watched both of them back to back, and I was impressed with the first one, super impressed with the second one. It's just a very captivating film, but it abandons that religious core message. It almost sort of defies it because we see the Ustad who has the faith be devoured, and so it's saying something drastically different here. Now, if it is intended to be a prequel, then we will eventually get to that religious moment. As it stands, it's a weird cult movie that comes out of nowhere that still has to deal with the idea of death, but now it's about terminal illness and how does a family cope with that. And as a man who took care of his father when his father was dying, totally understand that. There's sections of this beginning of the movie that hit me right in the feels. But it also deals with, the sins of our parents and the expectations of family and all of that stuff in leitmotifs. But it's mostly like, ooh, let's get scared. The director is one of the best filmmakers coming out of Indonesia right now. They have an MCU equivalent, and he's the guy in charge of it. The novelization of the film Phantasm was published in 1979 and written by Kate Coscarelli, the mother of writer-director Don Coscarelli. Although this was her first novel, it would not be her last, as she went on to have a successful career as a novelist, mostly writing romance novels. And you can kind of see that start here. She's very lurid with the sex scene. Like the beginning scene with the lavender, the lady in lavender, when Tommy enters her, she says cunt. I can't make it flowery. She just goes straight up and she's like, and he entered her cunt. That's literally what it says. And originally the book was only published in Japan and in Japanese for some reason. It wasn't until 2002 that it was published in the United States and in English. And then it was only 500 copies in a limited supply run. But the novel does introduce us to a lot of particulars about the Phantasm franchise that aren't really answered within the movies themselves. For example, the town actually gets a name, China Grove. We also get the name of the previous owner of Morningside Mortuary prior to the Tall Man, a man by the name of Charlie Hathaway, who has a sort of a nefarious past himself. Now, arguably, this is revised later when we realize that the Tall Man is inhabiting Jebediah Morningside himself. But we also, in the novel, get the idea that objects are tainted by the Tall Man's presence and by the Tall Man himself. Almost the way that objects are tainted by death. She does an amazing job of sort of describing the effect that death has on you, the effect it has that you don't expect. My father passed away a couple of years ago, and I had a troubled relationship with my dad, but still there are objects that instantly make me reminiscent, and that is totally reflected within this novel. She does a great job of capturing that. And to be honest, the novel's not a bad read. If you get a chance, go check it out. The Phantasm comic book is written by Stephen Romano, with artist and penciler Michael Broom, inker Noah David Hinson, and edited by Riccardo Bernardini. In the single-issue comic book, Mike finds that his dreams can alter reality, and so again, we're tapping into that area of part 2-ish and part 3-ish, but it's set during part 1. And once Mike discovers that he has this Inception-like ability, obviously the Tall Man wants to stop him. It was originally slated to be one of 4 issues, but after the first issue was published, the original company went bankrupt, so we never saw 2, 3, and 4. That first issue has been reprinted, but still kind of rare and hard to find. Hardcore fans of the Phantasm franchise call themselves fans, but spelled P-H-A-N-S. And 2 notable fans that we should talk about. J.J. Abrams, the writer, director, producer, absolutely loves the first Phantasm film. In fact, his company, Bad Robot, was involved with the remastering of the original Phantasm. He loved the movie so much that that's why he invited Angus Scrimm to be a part of Alias. And when first seeing the prototype designs for Star Wars The Force Awakens, he noticed that one of the characters of the First Order was silver and chrome and shiny like a Sentinel. So he dubbed that character Captain Phasma as an homage to Phantasm. Another, at least famous viewer of the film Phantasm is the bassist and lead singer of Motorhead, Lemmy. Lemmy was said to have been inspired in the middle of watching Phantasm to write down the lyrics for the song that would become Ace of Spades. But he's not the only musician to be obsessed with the film. This film series, and particularly the first one, have been sampled for numerous types of music and styles of music, a lot of times the heavy metal genre, ranging from bands like White Zombie to all the shit you see on the screen right now. The 1997 video game Blood starts at Morningside. GTA has the CUDA in it, it. And the Phantasm series has been referenced in Venture Brothers, Ugly Americans, Red Dead Redemption 2, Rick and Morty, Duke Nukem 3D, and even has 2 different documentaries about it, Tall Tales and The Women of Phantasm. They're 2 fan-made video games. One is an Atari-esque 8-bit game, and one is an RPG entitled Phantasm Armageddon, created by John Ivan. In 1980, a Russian bootleg novelization started making the rounds, and in it included a novelized second story, Phantasm 2. I have no idea what the fuck that's about though, because I couldn't find it. In 1990, a limited edition fan magazine entitled Phantasms is published internationally. In 1998, a fanzine created by Richard Elkins called The Sentinel starts its circulation. In 2016, Rue Morgue Magazines releases an authorized Phantasm film companion. 2020, everything fucking sucked, except for the fact that journalist Ben Wan released the Phantasm Compendium, a BTS look at the film series. Now, fans are often torn about different Phantasm films. Some fans don't like the second movie because Michael A. Baldwin didn't return. Some fans don't like the terminology provided in the third movie, Sentinels and Lurkers, and they prefer to call them spheres. And they would further classify those spheres as a drone sphere, which is just the regular silver kind, a battle sphere, which is the gold one, and the J sphere, which is the one that Jodie becomes. But we also can call those, drone sentinels, battle sentinels, or the J sentinel, whatever you want to fucking say. And then a lot of fans don't like the 5th film because it is so out there. But what's the future for the Phantasm series? Well, sadly, Angus Scrimm, the actor who played the tall man and embodied a huge portion of what makes this series so popular, has passed away. There is a documentary about Angus Scrimm that you can watch on YouTube, but it seems like with the passing of Angus, the ideas of taking the Phantasm films forward has sort of died with it. I have an idea. No one's gonna listen to it, but I'm gonna tell it to you anyway. It seems like this franchise would be perfect as a fucking anime. Every single movie gets a season, and you tell the story of Phantasm. You flesh out some of those details that make it more coherent. But the first movie is the childlike wonder something wicked this way comes type story, and then by the second movie, we skip 9 years and we're in the beginning of that post-apocalyptic world. The boy has now grown up to become a man, and each additional film is getting us to this more confrontational, giant scale, multiple dimensions, in and out of dreams, what is death sort of battle. And that would be fucking awesome, especially as an anime. Part of what makes the Phantasm series so unique and so special is that it is the same group of people consistently. And it's not like they are big name actors. It's not like they were doing a lot of film. They were friends of Cascarelli. And almost to do another version of that film would almost feel like blasphemy, because you don't have that familial connection. Vin Diesel would say it's all about fucking family, right? But I feel in an anime, you can sort of get around that. And an animated form, which would be so drastically different than the live action film, you can delve into the world of that dimension. Don't give me too much, Still, I would have the tall man as my main villain. Experiment with the idea of forms and what these lurkers do, and the gravers, and all the zombie things he creates, and the sentinel's powers, and all that shit. You could really have a lot of fun. And it lends itself to this balls to the wall fucking insane soul eater psychopath-like story. I would watch a fucking Phantasm anime. Would you? If so, type it in the doobly-doo that you would do it, man. Fuck yeah! Cascarelli, you listening? Make an anime, bro! Now, how would I rank the Phantasm films? It's gonna be fucking controversial. I'm gonna say it. I would go 4, 1, 5, 2, 3. How would I rank the Satan's Slaves films? I would go original, remake. 4 is haunting. 4 should not be as good as it is. Like, that idea of I just found some old footage and I'm gonna incorporate it into this new one shouldn't work as well as it works. But it works really fucking well. And I think because it works so well, it adds this whole other destined dimension to what the movie actually is. One of my favorite lines in cinematic history is in The Dark Knight, where the Joker talks to Batman and he's like, I have a feeling we're gonna be doing this for a long time. or whatever the fuck he says. That line implies this epic, lifelong, eternal struggle between good and evil. And Phantasm 4 encompasses that. The idea that this is always supposed to have happened, and it's larger than we think it is. It's just haunting, especially that last line, that last scene. God damn. I feel Coscarelli really, he knows what he's doing at that point. One is a classic to me at this point. Like, it's so dreamlike and it's so much passion in it. It's not the best movie, but there is something just admirable about it because you could tell he put everything into it. I'm trying. And to be honest, Something Wicked This Way Comes is one of my favorite stories. I fucking love the Disney movie of it. And it definitely has that vibe. It has that childlike innocence, and the tall man is a boogeyman. 5 is not a great film, but it has ambition to be something extreme and different. The Phantasm franchise doesn't rest on its laurels. It's not about, we're just gonna come back and do the same thing. We are. Reggie's gonna have the same shotgun and try to fuck a hitchhiker. But we're gonna add this whole other what if element to each installment. And 5 just does that in extreme ways that are clever and that are, that hurt my brain because it forces me to think about the franchise in a different light. It caught me off guard. It caught me by surprise at what it was trying to do. I dug that. It flaws and all. Don't get me wrong, at times, Ravager looks like a fan film. I made fan films, so I fucking know what those look like. I think it works on a story level. Original Satan's Slave, because I think it's really well made. Again, it shocked me where the story went because I didn't expect it. I didn't expect it to be a religious morality tale, and it became that, and that was kind of cool. Not necessarily that I was buying into it, but that it was a different perspective again, that affected me. And then I would do the remake of that. I really dug it. Again, it's the guy who directed it, Jojo Anwar, has a really good sense of tone. He's a really good pace. And you could tell he loved the source material. I think those two movies work really well if you watch them together, because part of the joy of the second one was seeing how they turned the first one on its head. His slow motion incorporation is really great. He's not trying to be fucking Zack Snyder. He's just making you feel something for this father. And then the character choices he puts in there are just very interesting. And then I get to Phantasm 2 because Amity's really hot. And then number 3, I like parts of it. I like Rocky. Rocky's cool. I like nunchucks. I fucking have nunchucks right here. Not even to use as a prop, but it was just like, I happen to have them and all that stuff. You know what I mean? So, and here's the thing. I don't think the Phantasm movies are all just exceptional filmmaking. But if you want to delve into some weird horror movies, this is a fun franchise to check out. If there's a franchise or a series of films or media or entertainment that you want me to talk about, put it down below in the doobly-doo. And you guys are awesome, and I like your faces.